children's time over, and we'll all enjoy that equally together. So before we get into that, though, as we are going to be joining Jesus after the resurrection as Easter people, as we said, I need to take you back with me to sixth grade year. All right, it was a pivotal year for me. My family had moved about a year and a half before, so I was finally kind of finding my feet and getting a good group of friends. And this morning, it could be titled Tale of Two Dans. All right, so this is the first story involving a Dan. This one being Dan Buckingham. He was the kid in our group, in our friends group, who everyone loved, for lack of better words, right? Everyone loved Dan. If Dan was going to be there, we wanted to be there. If Dan wasn't going to be there, well then, okay, what combination of us would make this situation work, this birthday party or this outing or whatever? But Dan was cool for a number of reasons. One, he could skateboard, very cool. Two, he liked punk music, also very cool. And, we weren't really picking up on the nuances of like the messaging in punk music, but we got there eventually probably. But Dan exuded confidence, and he was so funny just without seemingly needing to be or wanting to be. He was also in reading language arts with me, and we sat across from each other, and this was, I don't know if they still do this at schools, where you have to grade one another's work, right? You do your worksheet, and then you trade with the person across from you, which proved to be a problem for me and Dan. It never, I think, jeopardized our friendship, but maybe it added a little tension, because Dan didn't quite grasp that the worksheet is there for you to do. And so, whenever it came time to trade, my integrity was brought to the table to say, what are you going to do here, Kev? Are you going to look out for your friend first and foremost, or are you going to, do the job you came here to do? The teacher says, pull out your red pens, which also, let's pause and think about, what does that do for student community to make them pass judgment and hold one another's grades captive in a way? Anyway, that's just a problem maybe for school boards to figure out. But we pull out our red pens, and Dan, every question just about if it wasn't filled in or if it wasn't right, he'd be like, no, don't mark it, let me change it, let me cross it out. And sometimes I would let him, because it's like, dude, we gotta have a number higher than 0 here, all right? Let's try and break double digits at least. But most of the time, I would cross through it, and still our friendship never suffered for it, thankfully. But the biggest impact that Dan had on me was in that same class. A lot of the time, the reason he didn't get those worksheets done is because he and I love to doodle and draw. And the big difference is that Dan did all of his drawing in ink, just with his pen, which some young people today might call psychopath behavior. That is an interesting choice, to put it lightly, right? No, you usually draw with pencil because it can be erased. You can control maybe the darkness of the strokes a little bit more. Pen, it's permanent. You're locked in, all right? You can't sketch first and then put in detail later and erase the sketch. You got to go all in. And that was always intimidating to me, especially as someone who grew up doodling and having classmates be like, hey, you're pretty good at that. And I said, I'm going to treasure that in my heart. I wasn't going to take the risk of drawing in ink, of doodling in ink, until, one day I did. Because after all, Dan's pretty great. Maybe we could all afford to be a little more like Dan. And he was also a great artist. I loved the way that his stuff felt off the page because it was written and drawn in ink. And so, to this day, in my desk drawer at home, I have the, surprise, surprise, Spider-Man spiral notebook that in the back has this collection, a limited collection of Kevin's 6th grade ink drawings from reading class with Dan, which became some of my favorite, if not my best, one of my favorite drawings. Because as I got older and started overanalyzing things, I thought, that was a pretty defiant and formative practice, because I was pretty hard and fast. I was kind of scared of the pen, because that's not something that you do. That's not supposed to be how it's done. That's not the process. That's not the order. And yet, there's a few pages in the back of the spiral notebook that say otherwise. When it comes to the question of how things ought to be done, how things do or don't work, and the absolutism that we can apply to that, well, that brings us to the world after Jesus has been killed and raised from the dead. Because after all, what greater that's not supposed to happen is there than resurrection from the dead. And that's where we find John here. John is in the epilogue of his story, of his telling of Jesus' life. Chapters 20 and 21 are mostly epilogue, and this morning we're going to look at chapter 21, verses 3 through 8. where it tells us Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." And they said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just after daybreak, Jesus stood on the beach, but the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, you have no fish, have you?" They answered him, "No." Then he said to them, "Cast the net to the right side of the boat, and you will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because there were so many fish. And that disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on some clothes, for he was naked, and jumped into the sea. But the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far off from the land, only about 100 yards off. So, several details there that we'll kind of unpack as we go, but I find this verse layered with humor and comedy. I think that can be a helpful lens, despite what my undergrad preaching professor said of preaching is not the time to make jokes. And I said, okay, I agree, it's not the time to workshop what bits work and what don't, but I think there's space for that. I think it actually is a helpful lens for this text, especially because, like I said, John is in the epilogue. The work, the main event, has happened. For John telling his story and for Jesus living out his mission, the work is done. Jesus has taught, he has healed, he has prophesied, he has set the way that the church will then follow. He has been killed and he has been raised from death, the final victory over that which seems utterly unconquerable. So now everything after that might just be seen as bonus, as the cherry on top, as gravy. And I think Jesus doesn't see it quite so trivially, but I do think Jesus is maybe having a little bit of fun through these last two chapters. Chapter 20 and 21 is as Jesus is appearing to people, and I think of Jesus as a prankster in these, he might best be described as a little scamp, which might not be how we often think about Jesus, other than that one story where he stays in the temple when he's 12 years old, but that's because 12-year-old matches our idea of scamp more than 33-year-old scars on his hands. But when we actually look at what he's doing, whenever he appears to Mary, whenever he actually appears to anyone, he never tells them right off the bat that it's him. They never really recognize him immediately. And I like to think that he relishes in that a little bit. And then it says, "Surprise, I'm Jesus, ta-da!" And then, they have the response we would imagine. He does these little bits, you could think of them, right? Last week, as we were talking about the disciples hiding in the room after the resurrection, some of them have seen Jesus or have known that he was resurrected, and yet he appears in a room and the door is locked, and they don't recognize him. But then when they do, they say, "Jesus, it's you, amazing." Then like a week later, he does the same trick. He appears in a room with a closed, presumably locked door, because even Jesus knows that if you have a great bit, you got to do it at least twice. All right? You can't do it once. And we see him do something similar here when he appears on the shore at a moment where the disciples are seeking normalcy. Right? He doesn't appear as Jesus. He's just a guy to them. Right? They're 100 yards out. They're exhausted. They've been fishing all night. A detail that growing up I never really associated with this story. I think it had been glossed over. But it begins with Peter saying, not, "Hey, let's go do this," but rather, "I'm going to go do this." And to their credit, his friends say, "Well, you're not going to go do this alone. We're going to come with you." So they all go out on their boats, and in a lot of ways, it's like a new beginning. After all, that is where many of them were recruited. They were fishermen by trade. And so, in a moment of, after weeks of not knowing, being disoriented, with having the fundamentals of life and death challenged, they're returning. Or at least Peter is longing for and craving something that we know. We all do this in one way or another, right? It's that movie, your comfort movie that you watch over and over that you've seen 100 times. It's the practice of reading or the hobby or even just the person, even maybe just going back to your parents' house and not having to worry about keeping your own house in order. This is where we see Peter returning. I might not know much, I might be exhausted, I might have experienced a lot of fear, but I know fishing. I'm pretty good at fishing. Well, usually, except for tonight. But even as Jesus is keeping himself concealed and then stepping into a moment of likely high frustration for the disciples after an exhausting night of failing to to do what they thought they were very good at, he still hides these kind of Easter eggs or clues as to who he is. He addresses them as children. He says, "Children, have you no fish? Have you not caught anything?" Which is a strange way to address a boat full of grown professional fishermen, at least one of whom is naked. John decided to keep that detail in there. I don't know that I would have appreciated that verbiage, but I think it does signal relationship, a degree of intimacy or familiarity, right? To say children, beloved, or as I will often address my students whenever I'm getting their attention, okey dokey little smokies. Some of them appreciate that more than others. But it's a signal. You're someone to me, and I'm someone to you. Even though right now he's appearing as a stranger. A stranger, not just out of the blue, but a stranger now offering unsolicited advice with maybe an air of unearned or undeserved confidence. Right? "Oh, you don't have any fish? Guys who seem like they should obviously know what they're doing? I'm just throwing it on the other side." Where does he get the audacity? Where does this stranger on the shore get the gall to tell us how to do the thing that we've always done our whole life? Well, the idea of unsolicited advice, I think, probably strikes many of us as undesirable or unearned or undeserved confidence. And we saw this as our second story of a Dan this morning on our high school mystery trip when our own Dan Winder came along with us as one of our adult leaders. And one of our seniors, Anna Frost, is an area qualifier for discus. It's track and field season. And upon learning this, almost all the boys on the trip decided, "Oh, I know you got podium, but I bet I can throw that discus further than you." Which is interesting. It's like the more personalized version of watching the Olympics and seeing, ice skaters. And there's a difference between watching someone do figure skating and saying, "Wow, they make it look easy." But then the people of, a certain entitlement or privilege or thin decide that they look at that and instead they say, "Oh, I could do that." Or maybe I could even do that better, right? And that is exactly what happened with these boys. They were like, "Okay, you got podium, but did you get gold? I bet I could do gold. I bet I could do it better." And so Dan made it his mission that weekend. We're in San Antonio. We go to Mission San Jose. And while we are enjoying the mission, Dan is locked into his mission of finding a rock, kind of like finding a rock to skip across water, but instead a rock that would be about the right dimensions and weight to simulate a discus. We're walking away from the mission to get, after our lunches, we're getting back to our van, and we're crossing through another park, and Dan is like, "I found it, I got it." He picks up a rock, hands it to Anna. She kind of weighs it, considers it, "Okay, yeah, this will do, all right." And so now Dan is very organized, right? He's running, he's getting the guys lined up over here. He's having Anna demonstrate proper form, because there's I'm not gonna try and do it, but there's a step and a twist and a skip and then you throw, right? It's not just, ultimate frisbee or anything else. You're not just chucking this thing. And maybe it's that process, but again, that's how it ought to be done. And so Anna goes first, and she does the step, the hop, the skip, the throw. I don't think that wrong, but she throws it solid distance, right? And of course, as you might expect an area qualifier to do, she's like, "Not my best." It's okay, Anna. It doesn't have to be your best, because what we're about to witness is going to be a very embodied lesson in humility. Because the boys, one by one, step up, and it's not like 100% whenever you see a kid playing t-ball for the first time and they just throw it right to the ground. But it's not so more than that. So either following the process, it gets about a yard. Some of them get a little closer to the 60 yards or so that Anna got. And it wasn't 60 yards, that's not well, but it's a little further, but not a lot. No one is getting close to where Anna is. One doesn't quite get the same direction as it was supposed to go. It goes more over here, which is bad, because that's where most of us were standing. So we all made it out though. And afterward, seeing that no one got even close, no one really said a word, which I don't think was denial or humiliation. I think it was more of just a decisive lesson learned. All right. Good. We're all good? Great. Let's move on to our next thing. So I don't know what it was when the disciples are hearing this unsolicited advice from the shoreline of a stranger that would lead them, as the professionals, as the ones who know how because they know better. Against their better instincts, they cast on the right side. And that's a big deal because fishing boats back then are not the same as modern boats. The right side, where we get the word starboard from, comes from steering side, or steerboard, right? That is where boats used to be steered from. It was less of a rudder and certainly not a motor. It was more kind of steering oars. Most people were right-handed. That's where you get more of the power, especially when there's storms coming out of the sea. You're going to need that power for the steering oar. So Jesus saying, cast off on the right side is not just some person coming up and saying, hey, why don't you try this? Have we tried this out? They're saying, why don't you do this thing that is innately not what you're supposed to do? That is the exact opposite of what you're supposed to do. And I don't know if it was pure exhaustion and desperation that motivated the disciples to actually humor him. I don't know if they were like, okay, this guy is the worst. Let's show him. Let's show him how ridiculous this suggestion is, all right? So whether they then risked tearing the net and they throw it up out into the sea and then hoist it and catch it on the rudder, whether they did that or whether they went through the work of moving everything, picking up everything from the right side and changing it to the port side or the left side so that they could cast it. Regardless, they do it. What pain from this guy standing out on the shore, and yet, regardless of how they were feeling, when they tug on the net, it is so full of fish. Something impossible and silly, as if the fish couldn't cross an invisible wall under the boat from one side. But the demonstration on this other side, the side that you totally discounted, this side that you know better than to do anything other than steer, you will find abundance. And it's after that then John leans over to Peter. I wonder what John's tone was to Peter. I don't know if he's trying to just like provoke Peter to do something silly, right, where he says, that's the Lord, or if he earnestly recognizes that it is Jesus. But regardless, then Peter jumps into the sea, right? He throws on his clothes, jumps into the sea, and again, John including the line about him being naked is, John and Peter's relationship, I think, is very tricky. And I love that we get some of that in this text, because then, not only does Peter jump into the sea and swim across, John kind of passive aggressively says, and the rest of us stayed on the boat because we were not very far away. So Peter just was a little too enthusiastic. But maybe that is some of the beauty, because then then Peter runs, swims, wades through the water, running, rushing into Jesus and grace. Which is amazing, because this isn't even the first time that Peter's seen Jesus since the tomb. He's seen him a couple of times. He's heard the good news. He's supposed to know the good news. And yet, the sight of him, after this ridiculous and probably frustrating and yet still miraculous encounter, leads him to run, to rush toward him. I picture Jesus through these two chapters after resurrection, knowing that the work is done, kind of giggling his way through it. Both because he's being mischievous, but he's got blood in it too. He knows that the work is done. He also knows this is the end of this part of the story, my part of the story. Soon Jesus will have breakfast. He will speak with Peter, who had denied him, and he will reinstate him. He will say, "You can do this, and I still love you." Jesus sees that his time is about to end, but another story, another part of the story, is just beginning. This epilogue in John is becoming the prologue for the story of the church. The way that the good news, both of resurrection and of the miraculous abundance that this catch represents, is just now beginning. And I think Jesus is laughing not at the unknowing of the disciples, because there's plenty of the disciples don't know. There's plenty of the disciples will continue to not know. There is so much that we continue to not understand and know or get right, and yet Jesus is not burdened in the way of someone who is leaving his child with someone he's not totally sure about. No, he is laughing his way through this because he delights in us, because he knows the story, the good news is in good hands. He trusts his friends, his disciples, even for knowing they will make mistakes, it will be messy, but he knows that the story to come will be great. this is in such contrast from how the night began. When Peter is seeking normalcy and consistency, a return to the world, Jesus is interrupting that of, no, it's not about going back. It's not about going back to the way things were, because a return to the world and who we thought we were before this, that is returning to the world's rules as well. A world defined by scarcity, looking out for yourself, making sure you have enough, that if you're ever giving to anyone else, whether it's time or money or attention, whatever it might be, that's coming from a place of excess. Instead, it's this assurance of abundance. The net that is so heavy, it can't be lifted. But because the net is heavy, the disciples' hearts become light. Because there is it is true. There is enough. And when we make a shift from scarcity to abundance, we can have that permission to breathe. The assurance of abundance becomes permission to breathe, to let our guards down, to wonder what rules might need to be broken, what assumptions could be defied, what could come from them, because there's safety and assurance in the knowledge. There is enough. There's enough grace and forgiveness and goodness. Instead of the scarcity that defines the world they were so ready to return to. Because we are still always surrounded by senses and places that tell us how things are and aren't done. My wife works for Mesquite ISD. She works particularly with the Vento students, or students experiencing homelessness or housing insecurity in one way or another. And we can bring a lot of assumptions of how that looks and what needs to be done. There are signs, we live in Dallas proper, and there is a sign on so many intersections that say no to street charity, be part of the solution, right? Don't give money, right? It's not done. That's not how you fix it. That's not how you do good here. It's this scarcity mindset that tells us that's not how you do it. Instead of, what can we do? What could happen? We look at that person asking for money, we look at someone who is unhoused, we can make assumptions. We can say, here's what they need to do. I've got the solution. But instead, we can take that other perspective. There's a principle called housing first, right? It's not done that you get people linked up with resources first, right? We each need individually versus someone says, how about you just give the person without a house a house? And so many of us would crush and say, no, that's not how that works. What are you talking about? That's not it. Well, statistically, that is how it's most effective to help unhoused people, is to give them a place to live and the rest of them follow in place. One of my friends, Arlene, is an architect down in Austin working for Global Loaves and Fishes, who took that principle and then blew it up more. Because one thing that helps people or keeps people from continuing in an improved circumstance is, well, you're losing the community, the network that you had that helps take care of one another while we were all on the street together. And so they took housing first and grew it into community first, where people are not just getting housing, but in a community, staying connected, having those human resources, those relational resources as well. Whenever people would say a whole community just for these people who just need to stop being lazy, oh no, that's not how it's done. Well, maybe that's not how it's done. In a scarce world, but there's abundance, there's enough, and there's trust. I think of this moment as almost a gentler echo of the turning of the tables of the temple, changing minds, righting wrongs, joining in a laughing, seamless, loving God who says, you suspend your assumptions, you change your mind, you try something that seems ridiculous because you believe that something good, that there is in fact abundance. So what assumptions do we need to challenge? What side have you been clinging to for safety? What walls have you been keeping up because it feels like you can't afford to let them down? How might we challenge those assumptions and accept and we embrace God whose love and provision is abundant enough for all? Let's go together. So, dear God, thank you for this time that we can take to breathe. being assured of your abundance, that the end